Hello, welcome to Fireside with Peter Adkison on Gen Con TV. On this show, we go in search of the untold stories behind your favorite games. And this season, we are still exploring untold stories behind Dungeons and Dragons. This season, we have teamed up with the Dungeon Masters Guild, who has been introducing me to all sorts of new voices in Dungeons and Dragons. And today's guest is Ashley Warren. And Ashley is a founder of the RPG Writer Workshop, and she's worked on a number of projects, including the Uncaged Anthology series, and all sorts of other projects, which we're going to get to. So, Ashley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. You've had some really cool people on the show, so I'm honored to be among this great group.
Well, thank you. You're right. We have had some great people on the show this season. And I think Lisa is who we have to thank for that. Lisa Penrose over at the Dungeon Masters Guild. And of course, all those great people themselves, of course. Yes. So I'm very flattered that so many awesome, cool new voices in Dungeons and Dragons have joined us here on the show. So hey, what I like to do on this show is kind of start biographical. Ashley, so where were you raised? Where did you grow up?
Sure. So I was born and raised in the Bay Area in California and lived there until about high school. And then my parents decided they wanted a change of scenery. So they moved my brother and me to a small town near Lake Tahoe, which was a very different place than where I had grown up. But my family has been in the Bay Area for, several generations. So it was quite a move to go to a whole different state.
I'm back.
Yeah, you're back.
Did you catch the F-bomb as I went out?
Nope, you're all good.
Oh, sorry. Sorry to anybody watching there. We've been having technical challenges here. Me especially. Yeah. I'm sorry. So where were we? You moved to a little town outside of Lake Tahoe.
Correct. And I have been in Nevada ever since then. So I went to college in Reno, and that is where I currently live with my husband, Andrew, and our cat, Sophie.
Well, fabulous. So did you grow up in a family that played a lot of games? I mean, were you always a gamer, or did that kind of happen later?
That definitely happened later. I have always been a book nerd, and my mom has always really loved to read, so she really fostered that in me. So I've always been really into science fiction and fantasy and historical fiction and literature of all kinds. But in terms of gaming, I didn't really grow up around games, especially D&D. It was always kind of on the like on my mind as a geeky interest that I knew I wanted to explore someday, but it wasn't really something that I had a chance to actually try out for myself. I would have loved the opportunity to play D&D as a kid because I think I would have totally loved it. I probably would have gotten really obsessed with it.
Right.
So I am glad that eventually I came to find D&D in my life, but no, I didn't really grow up with it, and I didn't really know anyone who did. So I feel like for most of my life, I was aware of it, but I didn't really have a community of people to play with. I think I would have probably learned to be a dungeon master if I had had friends or someone who expressed interest in also playing it, but I just never really had that opportunity come up. So yeah, so I feel like D&D is very much an adult hobby that I've gotten into, and I think it stems from my lifelong love though of all of these things that kind of overlap. So it's always been something that I've wanted to try. So I'm very grateful that it's become such a big part of my life.
Oh, that's great. I am sorry to sorry to look away from the screen there for a moment. I was seeing if there was a process going on that I hadn't shut down or something anyway, because I keep getting little lags. But oh well, we'll soldier on and see how this goes. You mentioned you were interested in writing. Is that, I mean, not to skip forward to later, I'm sure we're going to talk about the writer's workshop, but did you come up through academia with an interest in writing and editing?
Absolutely. So I feel like writing is has always been a huge part of my life, even from when I was a kid. I always loved to write and I loved to read, and my parents really fostered that in me. So my mom was always, submitting my work to kids writing contests and entering me
Right.
into, little kind of competitions and things like that. And so I got a taste for publishing at a young age. And so I always knew that in some capacity I wanted to write. I didn't necessarily aspire to be a writer, at least like solely a writer. I always knew that I would probably want to teach or work in academia or work in libraries or do something related to writing and literature and all the things that I enjoyed. So I didn't necessarily set my sights solely on being a writer, but I just knew it was something that I would always want to do. So I did study writing related topics in school. So I went to college for English literature and I have a minor in French. And then I studied literacy studies in graduate school. So that's what my master's degree is in, is more education with a focus
Right.
on literacy studies and teaching learners of all ages, but specifically adult learners, and specifically teaching writing or teaching writers. And what I did in grad school was I worked at our university writing center. I led a like a pilot program at the local high schools, working with students on remedial writing. And so I really learned to love working with writers specifically. And that's kind of what's carried me into other aspects of my career, including the workshop, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, I definitely feel like being a writer is a huge part of who I am. I always feel like my personal identity is like writing, research, and education. And those are kinds of the three things that make up who I feel like I am. And so I'm always happiest when I can do things that combine all of those. And
Right.
in a weird way, like D&D does all of that for me. And I've been able to combine my educational expertise and just my general passions for writing and storytelling with
Yeah.
all the D&D projects I've gotten to do. So it's been a fun and kind of unconventional journey.
Excellent. Excellent. Now my video's frozen up. Can you still hear me though? Okay.
Sure, I can hear you.
I can be heard. Okay. Well, that's really, I have better things to say than to look anyway. So,
You look very thoughtful, so I think it's
oh,
if your
okay.
screen has to freeze, it's good to have it on a face that's not making a weird expression.
Yes. Good. All right. That's, well, the reason I brought that up actually is that, when, I think there's a long tradition of that. Like when I had the privilege of working with a lot of the TSR alumni back in the 90s, a lot of a lot of them came up with English degrees, went through academia, either writing, editing, English literature, that sort of thing. So you're following in a good tradition for that. So how did you get into Dungeons and Dragons then?
Sure. So my journey with D&D started really only a few years ago. I finally had a group of friends in my life who all wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. And as someone who had wanted to play for many years, I was like, well, why don't we actually put together a group? Like this is our time to finally play D&D. And luckily one of my close friends is someone who has been a dungeon master for years. I think he's probably DM'd for like several, a couple decades at this point.
Right.
So he had a lot of expertise and had played a lot of different editions. And he was like, I would be glad to run a game for you all. So we formed our group and we made our first characters, which were not very good. I was not a very good rogue. It was fun to play rogue, not very good at it. And it didn't really matter though, because I just got immediately hooked on playing D&D. I loved pretty much everything about it. I loved that it was an activity that I could do with my friends. I loved that it was about communal storytelling and really immersive storytelling, which is just a passion of mine anyway. And I just really liked the idea of storytelling in this way. It's so different than reading a book or engaging with other forms of more passive media. And I just was like, I know that this is going to be a huge part of my life moving forward. And it has been. So about, I would say a year or so after we had been playing in our campaign pretty regularly, I think we were meeting weekly at that point, and we were just like, we were all in. It became like our whole life. Then I was
Nice.
like,
Nice.
I want to write my own adventures. So luckily I had a platform that I could do that on, which was Dungeon Masters Guild. And I just,
Well, hold on before let's get to. I want to go back to, so your first experience playing. You played a rogue.
yes.
Yes. I mean, Can you remember, was there like a light bulb moment where like the first time like, oh my God, the way this game plays, like, were you like blown away kind of the very first time you played it?
I was, because yeah, I feel like the light bulb moment was probably as soon as I rolled the first die and I realized how much that impacts the story, and just like how interesting it is that the dice rolls affect our decision making, and we just, even though you can have this narrative arc that you've planned, you really don't know what's going to happen in your
Oh no,
session.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
right,
So
yeah.
that was
I,
really exciting for me.
I like that. I like that way you said that. The way the dice affect the story. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
I
which
mean,
I think
it.
is, especially with friends, everyone has some ideas for what they want to do, but we don't know how that's going to play out
Right,
until it plays out. So that was like what
right.
I found really compelling, is that we never knew what was going to happen every session. And yeah, so I feel like that was kind of my light bulb moment. I was just thinking how different it was from the other forms of storytelling that I really loved, and how special that was, and unique of an experience that was.
Well, and you mentioned that you didn't think you played a rogue very well. I think the rogue is the hardest class to play in Dungeons and
Hmm.
Dragons. I mean, because what you really want to do and what the party want to do is not always the same thing. I mean, you're the class that often has somewhat different ideas of how things should be done, maybe, than everybody else. I mean, I don't know. It can be tough.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly feel like I was bad at playing a rogue because I, at the time, didn't quite know how sneak attack worked. So I was always doing like, I was never doing enough damage, and I always felt perpetually underpowered. But that was just my mistake of like not fully understanding how
Sure.
to really make like leverage my character build to the fullest. But I also was playing a rogue who was essentially a librarian, which is very true to who I am as a person. And she was basically just, her goal was always to find, books. And so her background was the sage background. And so she's basically kind of Indiana Jones-esque, but not nearly as cool as that. It's like a dorky Indiana Jones. And so I feel like I just wasn't always playing a rogue very like rogue-ish. And I also I personally don't believe in being a jerk to my party members. And so I would never play a rogue that would like try to steal items from my fellow players or things like that. I
Sure.
just felt like that
Sure.
seemed not fun for anyone. And I don't really like when people, I think it's fun to play that with NPCs, but it's different when it's your own friends. So I didn't want to play a rogue who was always being kind of a jerk.
Yeah.
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 So
Yeah.
I quickly moved on to Warlock, which is now my favorite class ever. Love Warlocks.
Oh,
Warlocks for
well,
life.
okay. Well, what is it about Warlock? I mean, like, we could talk, but we'll get to your work. Yeah, but let's tell me about the Warlock. I mean, like what speaks to you about the Warlock? Because I gotta admit, I haven't DM'd a Warlock yet in my
Mm.
campaign, so I'm only peripherally familiar with it in 5th edition.
Oof, okay, there's so many things I love about warlocks. So my first warlock that I made was actually my second character, and that's when I really felt like I had a better understanding of how D&D worked in general. And so I was able to make a character that I felt worked a little bit better. I'm not saying she has very good stats, because I always make characters that are a little bit broken, or I always put stats toward the things that I think are fun rather than the things that you should
Oh,
put
oh,
them toward.
good. Yeah, of course, Ashley. By all means. Oh my God, there's so many times I've had experienced D&D players give me crap about how, well, that's not where I'd have put my stats for that monk. And like, well, I
Yeah.
wasn't making Bruce Lee. I was making Bolo Young. I mean,
Right. I like to make characters that, I don't know, I'm very thoughtful about the stats, but that doesn't always mean that my stats are very balanced. Whereas my husband always makes very well balanced characters that always, have the best of what the class allows, which I think is also a fun way to play. But for me, I like opportunities for role play. So I pick my spells based off of that. And I, allocate my points to the things that I think my character can make the most use out of. But when I was building my warlock character, I love that warlocks are spellcasters, but I feel like in terms of spellcasting as a D&D class, I just bought my mic, sorry, that they are
here, I
relatively
have mine
easy.
too. I have mine just for, solidarity.
Yeah. I'm always wildly gesturing. I'm half Italian, so it just
Good.
comes with the territory, but I'm
Please do it. I'll
constantly,
try and keep up.
yeah, I'm always gesturing during streams and like constantly bumping my mic, which is okay on videos streams, maybe not so much for podcasts though, where audio is important. Anyway, I also get excited about talking about Warlocks because I just think they're so fun. But I just realized that as a spellcaster, it's kind of an easier spellcaster to play than some of the other classes. I think every class has really fun features, and I think I've played most classes at this point, at least for one shots. But I always come back to Warlock because I like the way that spellcasting works for Warlocks, because you don't have to manage a ton of spells. You don't have to prepare your spells. You have what you have. It levels with you, and you kind of have a small selection, which is hard because you can't do as many things as other spellcasters, but it just means that the spells that you do have tend to be pretty good. Like, I know everyone likes to kind of put down Eldritch Blast, but that's such a fun spell. And if you treat it kind of like your sword, like if you were a fighter, when you always are using your sword, that's how I think of Eldritch Blast for Warlocks. Like, that's your go-to like attack. So I think Warlocks are really fun, but to me, the Warlock build, I like to get really high level with it. So for me, Warlocks kind of represent this pursuit of knowledge that you can get through a lot of different types of patrons. And I never play evil Warlocks. I always play pretty good Warlocks, like Warlocks that have good ambitions, but have kind of sought out the gray area to accomplish those. So it's not, to me, it's very similar to kind of a cleric relationship, but I just kind of like to treat that a little bit differently with your patron, because your patron can be so many different things. It doesn't have to be like a deity. It can be just any sort of source that can give you some power. And so for me, just on a personal level, I always feel like that's how I feel about pursuing knowledge. That's how I have always felt as like an academic and a writer, is that I'm seeking out information and knowledge from, you know, a variety of sources, and then choosing what I do with it. And so that's kind of how I feel about Warlocks, is that it's not that your patron has to necessarily define you. And I actually think that like conflict between a Warlock and a patron is really, really fun, especially for role play.
Absolutely. I'm really hoping that I get a chance to DM one soon, because it does look like a lot of fun, and like a lot of ways to just kind of, you know, reel in a player, you know, I mean, not to try and control them, but just a string. And as a GM, you're always looking to have strings tied to each of the characters, hopefully 3 or 4 of them that you can just kind of pull on every once in a while, and get them all a little worked up. Okay, as much as I would love to go through every single D&D character class with you, Ashley, I really do think that would be a lot of fun. Maybe I should get to your professional career, Dungeons and Dragons. So how did you get started? Like, you know, how did you make the transition? What made you want to do it, and how did you make it happen?
Sure. So I started to have ideas for my own adventures pretty early on in the process of actually learning how to play D&D. And I have a background in, you know, writing and being published. I worked as a journalist for several years, and I already kind of had overcome some of those early obstacles of what is it like to get your work published and have other people read it. So I felt, even though I was very new to D&D specifically, I felt like that gave me a little bit of kind of a starting point, at least in knowing that I could produce an adventure on my own. I had, you know, enough design skills and kind of just general skills to put together an adventure. And I also knew that Dungeon Masters Guild existed as a platform for me to publish my work. And so that's all I really needed. And to be honest, I didn't know a whole lot about Dungeon Masters Guild at the time. I had no idea how, you know, big the audience was there, and really anything about the community. I just knew that it was a place where you could publish your D&D content. And I thought, like, why not? I have ideas. At the time when I wrote my very first adventure, I had just gone on a family trip to Italy. And so I was really inspired by Italy, specifically Venice. And I was like, I want to write a one-shot adventure about, you know, Venetian masks. And so that was like really what my first adventure was. And I just kind of started from there.
I'm resisting the temptation to talk about Italy now. I mean,
I know. Always want to talk about Italy. I love Italy. And I mean, in general, I put a lot of my personal heritage into a lot of the projects that I work on. So like I mentioned, I'm Italian, so I gesture wildly, but I'm also Russian Jewish on my paternal side. And so I like to pull in a lot of that folklore into the work that I do as well. And I've personally found that to be a really fun way to, you know, really harness the things that I love about my family heritage and storytelling in the D&D setting, because so much folklore in D&D is kind of inspired by the mythology of the world's cultures, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we talk about Uncaged. But I just felt really inspired by D&D as a storytelling medium, and I wanted to try it. So I did. I just put together an adventure. Once I got the idea, I just worked on nothing else for like a few weeks. I mean, other than my day job. And I just was like obsessing over it. And I just worked on it until it was finished. And then I released it. I play tested it first with
So
my home group, and then I released it, and it just kind
yeah,
of went from there.
what was that first adventure? Is this something you published on Dungeon Masters Guild? Is this something that's still available, or yeah?
It is. It ended up, I not redid it, but I reformatted it, I think a year or two ago.
I don't think this was one of the links you sent me though.
No, I have quite a few projects on Dungeon Masters Guild, so I didn't include all of that. But if you do want to find my one-shot adventures, they are all on Dungeon Masters Guild. It is called A Night of Masks and Monsters, and it is very much your classic masquerade with monsters. You get, and actually one of the cool things that I still like about that first adventure is that I created, each player or each character gets a mask before they go into this castle. So you have to put on your mask before you can go to this party, and the mask gives you like some special powers and things like that. And there's like a little bit, it's like a murder mystery. It's kind of like, just it's very like your classic tropes, but that's what I like to explore, is kind of your classic tropes that you would encounter in myth and folklore and storytelling, and then kind of put a little bit of a twist on that. So that's the first adventure.
And Marcus has posted a link to Massive Monsters, a Requiem of Wings. Yes, an item. Yes. Well, that sounds great. Okay, so so you must have been pleased with that experience and how it went.
Sure. I mean, I would say I don't even know if it mattered to me then that people were reading or engaging with my work. It was exciting when I did see that people were downloading it and buying it. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, that gives me some idea for how the community here works on DM's Guild. I still don't really know anyone through DM's Guild at that time, but it was more that I just got really into the whole process of producing an adventure, from writing it to doing the design to making the cover art for it. And I just thought it was really fun to put together, kind of package these ideas that I have in that full way, because usually in publishing, you don't get to have your hands in every part of the process like you do with independent adventure design. Usually if you write, a book or a story and someone else publishes it, you're not the one who is also doing the layout design or all the other, marketing for it. And so I found it really fun to really be a part of every single part of this process for my own work. Of course, now with the projects that I do, that's a little bit different, but that is still kind of what I find appealing about adventure design, is that of course the adventure is the most important part, but I liked the whole aesthetic and setting up the whole atmosphere for my own work and really being in control of that whole part of the process, because I think as a writer, that's rare that we really get to do that. And so I just had so many ideas. So right after that, I started publishing pretty much an adventure a month until I think about 6 or 7 months. And I was just on a tear.
Wow.
I just was like, I couldn't stop. I just had so many ideas and I was just so excited about this and I feel like at that point in my life, I've always been a fiction writer in some capacity, mostly just for my own personal enjoyment. But I had kind of moved away from that kind of writing in my life. And I was doing a lot more, academic writing, journalistic writing. I was doing research for writers. Like I was working in the literary communities, but I wasn't always doing fictional output myself. So that really got me back into that, which was fun.
So we have a question from Ryan in chat, and Ryan asks, as someone, oops, it scrolled, there it goes. As someone who still can't figure out their place in life, what are the first steps one should take if they want to if they want to write fantasy stories for a living, but don't know where to start?
Sure. So I think that, and I personally, I hate when people give advice for like, just start, because that's such an ambiguous place to, tell people to start, because the starting point for everyone is a little bit different. For me, my starting point was when I was a kid. So it's hard for me to like necessarily give the same advice to someone else. But I do think that you can become a writer at any point in your life. And I think you absolutely should, because everyone has a story to tell, and I think you should feel empowered to tell it. So I would say to start small. If you do want to write fantasy, start by writing a short story, even it can just be a couple of pages. You might even like flash fiction where you're just writing, like 500 words, and there's just this really small story that you're telling, but you're really focusing on the fantastical elements of that. And I think as you do more of those short forms of writing, you can work up to the long forms of writing, and you can also start building an audience that way. So you might consider starting a blog and sharing your short stories, or doing something fun on like Twitter or Instagram where you really use those platforms to tell different like snippets of your stories. And I think just knowing how your own personal writing process works for you is really, really important, because if you do aspire to write full time, that's a lot of creative output. So you really need to kind of get in the habit of producing creative work regularly, which can be hard. And it's actually really hard on our brains to constantly be creating. So I think if you can start small and just work your way up from there, really build your skill set, build it as, build your habits, read a lot of fantasy work. Reading makes us better writers. I can't recommend it enough. Then I think you really can start to hone your voice as a writer, and you have a starting point, and you're kind of building your own portfolio. So that's what I would recommend. Start small, write some short fiction, short stories, and share it with people.
And I think Ryan, by what Ryan said, I'm excited to start the writer workshop this weekend. So I think you're going to hear more from Ryan soon.
That's wonderful. I mean, I also do recommend the RPG writer workshop as a starting point. That really is one of our goals. Yes. Yeah, to help people get started.
Another question. Bobby writes, if I write an adventure, can I use official places in Dungeons and Dragons as my location/setting?
So that is one of the main benefits of writing and publishing work on Dungeon Masters Guild specifically. So on Dungeon Masters Guild, the community has access to specific settings that you can write for, including Forgotten Realms, Ravenloft, Eberron, Theros, Ravnica. Look on the website for the actual list of locations, but you get to use all of that content. You can use creatures from the monster manual. You can use anything that's in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So those are like the main benefits of writing content and then publishing on Dungeon Masters Guild, is that you can use that IP and then make money from it and not have to recreate a lot of those things from scratch. There are some locations that are off limits that aren't part of that licensing agreement. So I just recommend going to Dungeon Masters Guild and reading through their FAQ. And that is a little bit different than publishing to DriveThruRPG, where you can make use of the open gaming license for D&D, but it doesn't give you all the same IP that you're able to use on Dungeon Masters Guild. I would recommend, I don't want to provide any legal advice, but that's kind of the general spiel of how that works.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I don't want to provide any legal advice either. Yeah. So what's the catch? I mean, that sounds like a pretty good deal. Does what you write, let's say you write an adventure in Forgotten Realms, is there an approval process then, or is you just write it and post it?
So on Dungeon Masters Guild, there's not really any friction to getting started, which I also think is a benefit. So when you publish your work there, it doesn't really go through any sort of screening process. They do have a team that looks through all the new titles to make sure that there's no, licensing issues or plagiarism or any sort of issues where like you're using art that you're not supposed to be using and things like that, which is a little bit different again than DriveThruRPG, which is part of, which is like a sister site to Dungeon Masters Guild. They have some different licensing agreements with publishers, but they're both platforms where you can publish D&D content. So there are some differences there, but I don't really feel like there's a catch to publishing on Dungeon Masters Guild, other than, I mean, they do take a royalty share, which DriveThruRPG also does, which, I mean, I personally think is fair because you're getting to use all of this IP. You can use several decades worth of content in your own work. And I think that's a good thing.
Can I ask you the economics there? If it's a $10 item, how much of that do you get?
So you get 50%.
Okay, and so then half is going either to Dungeon Masters Guild, or maybe some of it's going back to WotC.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know how that works. I'm not affiliated with Dungeon Masters Guild other than just being a passionate advocate for it. But I believe, the other 50% goes back to all the work that goes into keeping Dungeon Masters Guild as a platform and their team that runs it and all that stuff.
Oh yeah, so, sure. Yeah. Well, that's not That's not bad. I mean, if you were making books, making a game supplement and had your own company and you were selling it, you wouldn't be selling it at you could sell for full retail if you're selling directly to consumers, but oftentimes you'll be selling to distributors with a huge discount from that. And it's all digital too. So
Yeah, and they do have there is a limited print program on Dungeon Masters Guild that I think is on hiatus right now, but every now and then you can get your work published as a print book as well. So we actually did that with the Uncaged project. So some books are available on Dungeon Masters Guild as both digital and print work,
right,
which is pretty cool.
right. I saw that your Uncaged Anthology has a hardcover version, or is it one of the yeah.
It's a hardcover. It's a big book, so it had to be hardcover.
It looked big and awesome, and it had a pretty high price point, but actually just made me want to buy it more.
Well, good. Yeah, we get a lot of conflicting information or feedback on our price point. It's either too high or too low. That's what's one of the many challenges when you're an independent creator and independent publisher is what do you price your work at? So it's just there's always so many factors that go into that.
Okay, we got a follow-up question from Bobby. In my adventure, if I'm writing stories with interweaving player character storylines, how can I refer to specific player characters if I don't know the names they will choose?
Sure. So that's a good question. So first of all, I would like to recommend that if you haven't already, to read through other published adventures or campaign books, because for me, that always clarified how adventures are actually written and structured, because it is hard to know things like that. And I certainly didn't. So usually when you're writing adventure content, you're not referring to the specific characters in every party. You're just referring to characters or the party. And so you would just actually use words like if the characters make a perception check of whatever, this happens. So you just refer to them as characters, and actually that's part of the style guide for writing Dungeons and Dragons content. There's a free style guide that you can download on Dungeon Masters Guild if you want to actually write this kind of content. It basically says like, this is how you would phrase these things, here's the words that you would use. And so when you're writing adventure content, typically you would write just characters or the party, sometimes if you're referring to things that the whole party would be doing. And it's not really our jobs as D&D writers to know everything about a group. So we just can't know all those things. We can't account for everything a group is going to do. So you keep it generic enough that you're giving the dungeon master all the information that they need to make a scenario play out at the table without overwriting too much where they have all these things to keep track of. But I would recommend reading some adventures just to kind of get a sense for how other writers phrase things and kind of what the standards are for writing those kinds of elements in your story.
Right. So you're giving some great advice here, Ashley, and there was a mention of a writer workshop. I think that seems like a great segue. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your writer workshop?
Sure, I would be happy to. So the workshop is like, I have lots of like creative babies, but the workshop is really special to me. So the RPG Writer Workshop is an online learning community where we help teach people how to write adventure content. And I would say that we don't necessarily focus on all the various things that go into narrative design, but we mostly focus on process. And so if you want to start writing adventures, we have an upcoming workshop that starts on Sunday, actually, November 1st. That's called the Write Your First Adventure Workshop. And in that course, we take our participants from start to finish. So by the end of the workshop, the goal is to publish your adventure to Dungeon Masters Guild or Drive Through RPG or wherever you want to publish. And so through that workshop, you can really learn what goes into an adventure. How do you write an adventure, including, the style guide? How do you include world building into a short one-shot adventure without, making the scope of your project so big that you can't finish it? How do you include, environments and atmosphere and all the fun stuff that makes adventures what they are? So that's what that workshop covers. And in general, though, the RPG Writer Workshop's goal is to give writers in our industry, in our community, a place to get started. So we do have some other courses besides that, but the Write Your First Adventure course is is our flagship course and really what draws most people to our community. And we just have an awesome community of writers who always want to provide
It
feedback and
sounds like a
help and
lot of
support.
fun. I mean, it sounds like a blast.
It is a blast. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun.
And this runs for a month, right? You do, is it like the calendar month from the beginning of the month to the end of the month? Is that kind of the routine?
Correct. So we host this particular workshop, the Write Your First Adventure workshop, every July and November, actually because it coincides with National Novel Writing Month, which usually happens in July and November. So this is kind of our version of write a creative project in 1 month. So yeah, the next workshop starts on November 1st, it ends on November 30th. And all the information's on our website. We do have a free path for people who just want to get some of the free resources, maybe aren't ready to commit. And then we have 2 premium paths, one of which is sponsored by Dungeon Masters Guild, who we've partnered with for the past few workshops. And they work to help promote the adventures that people publish, which is a really great way to get a lot of eyes on your adventure after it's finished. And they provide some other resources. And actually for this workshop, they sponsored some art scholarships. So what that means is that people who receive those art scholarships can commission some custom art for their adventures, like a special cover piece or something like that. So that was really cool.
That's clever. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
There's one comment. It's not a question, it's just a comment, but it's so sweet. I want to read it. Emmerich writes, I'm doing my second RPG writer workshop. So, okay, you can do it more than once. It's a great resource and highlights how great the community is in terms of support and sharing. That's fabulous.
That's so kind. And I will say, we do have a lot of people who return for multiple workshops, even though it's called Write Your First Adventure. A lot of people write their second, third, fourth, 10th adventure. And
I want to write my eighth adventure.
Well, absolutely. Because I think what people like about it is it's not, even though it's an introductory course, we focus on process. And there's something that's really nice about setting a goal for yourself and then having a community to actually help you accomplish that goal and being guided through each of those steps. Because I think when writers are embarking on this for the first time, how do you know where to start? There's so many starting points, and the internet has a lot of great resources, but if you're just doing a Google search, there's kind of an overwhelming amount of information. So I feel like our job is to help kind of disseminate some of that information, share resources, provide some structure. I really believe in structure as a way to actually encourage creativity, because I feel like when we have some parameters, it kind of unlocks the creative, aspects of our minds. Right. So that's really what the benefit of the workshop is. So that's why we have a lot of people who return, because they like being a part of the community. They find it motivating and good for accountability to have people who are also working through the same stages of the process that they are.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings is constraints breed creativity.
Yes.
That's absolutely very important. Bobby wants to know, how much does it cost?
Sure. It's $35. That's for either premium option. The core curriculum for both premium paths is the same. The main difference is that one is the Dungeon Masters Guild path. And so when you're part of that path, you get to be considered for the art scholarship. You get to be part of the promotional things that they'll do at the end of the course. Whereas the other path is more for people who might not even be writing D&D content. We have a lot of people who write for other game systems like Call of Cthulhu. And so if you're more just writing for other game systems, or you want to keep your adventure a little bit more, generic in terms of rule set, then that's a good path for that. And we share different resources, with each of those paths.
So Ashley, we got to talk about some of your other work now. You've done so much. We're 2/3 the way through the show here, and but I'm glad we spent some nice time on the writer works. It sounds great. I got to say, if I wasn't so busy, I'm launching a YouTube channel here next month, so my time is really precious. But man, Bobby says. Bobby just signed up, Ashley.
I'm so glad.
We got you.
Love it. We're glad to have you in our community.
Bobby, you have to report back and let us know what you thought in a future show.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we really should talk about Uncaged.
Sure.
Don't you? Why don't you? I mean, this looks great. This is about monsters, but told in a little bit different way than the tradition, right? And so, why don't you explain the idea to our audience?
Sure. So the Uncaged Anthology is a 4-book series published on Dungeon Masters Guild, and each book is a collection of one-shot adventures that each feature a creature from mythology and folklore, but with a bit of a twist. And really, the whole point of the project was to focus specifically on female creatures and monsters that are found in D&D lore. So our first book featured Medusa, who is a prominent figure in mythology, but also comes up a lot in D&D content as well. And really our goal with the series was to use the communal storytelling aspects of D&D to subvert the tropes that surround these creatures, because there's so many creatures that we read about in mythology and folklore growing up, and with D&D we now have the opportunity to actually interact with these creatures in different ways, which kind of changes their stories a little bit. So Uncaged was a pretty big global collaboration. There are more than 100 people involved from across the world.
It's a
And
long list of people that worked on this.
oh yes, it was quite the project to project manage. Definitely the biggest project I've ever managed. Probably would not do it again, at least not at that size. But it was such a great experience, and we have such a close-knit community now that it was a wonderful but very intense year and a half producing all of those books. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of Uncaged. And what I think is especially cool about Uncaged is that for many of our writers and artists, that was the first time that they had ever written an adventure, the first time they'd ever been published. And so we all got to be part of this really, amazing project that ended up becoming so much bigger than any of us really expected. When I first put the call out on Twitter for this project, I was not expecting such an overwhelming response. So I feel like I've just been running to catch up ever since. But yeah, that's kind of what Uncaged is in a nutshell.
That's fantastic. Well, I gotta say, Bobby's really excited.
Yay! Oh, I'm so glad. I'm excited too.
I'm excited for both of you. This is great. Okay, so can you let's see, what's the best way to explore a little bit more of Uncaged? Like, can we go through an example? I mean, I suppose that's spoilers, but yeah, who cares? We do spoilers here all the time. We can well, you mentioned the Medusa. So what's the twist on the Medusa?
So actually Medusa, so when we were putting together or working on the book, I basically let the writers pitch what they wanted, what creature they wanted to focus on and how they wanted to retell that story. So we actually have a few different adventures, I think, throughout the series that feature Medusa. And really what our goal was not always to completely reinvent the stories from scratch, but more to give these creatures a chance to be portrayed a little bit differently. So when it comes to Medusa, in Greek mythology, her story is actually kind of a tragic story. And Medusa has always been kind of she's portrayed differently throughout the years, but often she was seen as kind of a victim of her circumstance. And so what we really wanted to do with our book was give the characters agency in ways that they might not have through the more traditional forms of storytelling. And so it's not so much that we're making all of these monsters into like good, people or creatures. It's just that we're giving the characters a chance to interact with them in ways other than just flat out hostility. And so what we're hoping is that when you bring these stories to your table, that they're thought-provoking and maybe makes you think of how you engage with monsters in your games, maybe in a different way. And so I don't know, I don't really want to spoil a Medusa story, but I can talk about the one that I wrote with Uncaged, which was about Baba Yaga.
Oh my gosh, yes. Tell me about your Baba Yaga spin, because for some reason Baba Yaga has been coming up in my life lately.
I think that's a wonderful omen. I love Baba Yaga. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm of Russian ancestry, so I love Russian folklore, and I love how kind of dark it is. Of course, lots of folklore and fairy tales get very dark, but with Baba Yaga, she's traditionally portrayed as some, kind of your classic evil witch. Obviously, there's more to her story than that, but in my version of Baba Yaga, I turned her into, okay, well, let me back up a little bit. So I'm really also passionate about World War II history. So what I did was kind of a fantastical version of World War II in my adventure.
We could go down that rabbit hole too. Okay, yeah.
Don't even get me started. I love talking about World War II history. It's just a lifelong passion of mine. And also one of my favorite books is like a fantastical version of World War II featuring Baba Yaga. So I kind of wanted to do my own spin on that. So I basically took the Night Witches, which were a group of Soviet snipers in World War II, female Soviet snipers that were called the Night Witches as a group name, which I think is rad as hell. And so I actually turned them into real Night Witches in my adventure. So they're all witches and they work for Baba Yaga, who's the commander of this like unit of this militia unit. And what their goal is to protect this town from demons that are infiltrating the city that's kind of based off of Leningrad and, you know, all of its fun, tumultuous history.
Yes.
But it's really just a fantasy city that keeps being infiltrated by demons. And the leader of that city keeps blaming it on Baba Yaga and the Night Witches, like, oh, they're the ones bringing the demons in, but they're not. They're just trying to protect the people from the demons. So that was kind of my twist off of that. So she's basically a commander, and she's just this badass old woman who has, you know, gone through war and is kind of like a grizzled veteran who wants to protect, you know, her younger female soldiers. And what I thought was cool is that in the classic folklore of Baba Yaga, she rides around in a mortal and pestle. It's like her, it's kind of like this hovering thing that she rides in. And so in my version, I changed the mortar to like an actual like mortar, like a weapon that you would use in World War II. So that was kind of like, I tried to pull in these little, you know, threads from World War II, but make it fantasy so that it was still D&D friendly. And yeah, but I just wanted to kind of empower these, you know, this kind of classic female creature who's always seen, you know, when we think of old women in folklore, they're usually evil witches eating babies, doing mean things to people because they're old, I guess. Like we ascribe a lot of like evil traits to old women in our world. And so I always love opportunities to kind of change that dynamic a little bit, that, you know, older women have a lot of wisdom to share with younger women. And I think that that's something to embrace. So that's kind of the overall theme of my adventure. So that was really fun to use some of my favorite, you know, characters in both history and folklore and put them together in my adventure. And I think that that's kind of the general theme of Uncaged is, I think we all kind of put bits and pieces of ourselves and our own heritage into the stories that we retold.
That's great. That's fantastic. Yeah. I'm suddenly wondering, just randomly, you know, if there's a female dragon, but like one of the D&D evil dragons, that somebody did a story along that line.
Well, there's definitely Tiamat. So we've actually been talking about doing a 5th volume of Uncaged. I don't have a good timeline for this, but we wanted to do a volume of Uncaged that featured all of the like goddesses or really high level deities in D&D, specifically the female ones, you know, Umberly and Oral and Tiamat and, you know, all the really good classic goddesses in D&D who are often, you know, portrayed as evil, you know, usually rightfully so. But we think that that would be a fun project to do. That would be kind of in the spirit of Uncaged, is to kind of give players a chance to interact with those goddesses in maybe a new way. So that could be fun. So that's on the agenda. Our community, what happened after Uncaged is that so many of our artists and writers and editors got so busy with work because Uncaged brought a lot of new people to a lot of our work that we're just also busy right now, which is a wonderful outcome. So I don't know when we're going to do Uncaged Goddesses, but it is on the agenda.
Oh, that's fabulous. That's fabulous. Well, that's great. That's really good. So you just finished a Kickstarter, right? Heckna, were you this was your project, is that right? Campaign horror?
I mean, I don't claim it as just solely my project. So I'm the lead writer on Heckna, but it is produced and published by Hit Point Press, which is a company that's also made Humblewood. They've made the Deck of Many animated spell cards. They just produce really beautiful work in the D&D industry.
Right.
And so, yeah, so I have been working on this book with them for pretty much the whole year. But yeah, we just did our Kickstarter a couple of weeks ago, I guess almost a month ago. Time makes no sense to me right now. And 2020 time doesn't, is fake.
Yeah, it's a crazy year.
So Heckna that's my current project that I'm working on, and we just had a really successful Kickstarter, and yeah, it's just been really fun. I have worked on, big projects before. Obviously, Uncaged was a pretty large project that I produced,
Right.
but I haven't actually written a full campaign book from start to finish. So this is the first time that I've done that with Heckna. So it's been fun. I've been learning a lot about writing a full book from start to finish, because it's very different, obviously, than writing, an adventure. And I'm glad that I had written all the adventures that I had before I worked on Heckna, because I feel like it set me up well to work on a project of this size. But yeah, it's just a really fun setting.
So tell now I'm seeing Derek Marcus posted that it was covered on Table Takes
Awesome.
here on Gen Con TV on Friday. But hey, let's cover at the risk of being redundant. So tell everyone a little bit about Heckna. Right? It's a carnival, sort of horror / carnival sort of theme, right?
Yes. So we call it Cosmic Carnival. So it's basically, cosmic horror. So there are some, I won't say like eldritch or Lovecraftian, but it's very much like horror in that vein. And it's a carnival setting. It's a dark carnival, so it's very spooky, but it's also silly. So for me, a lot of my inspiration for Heckna was, Tim Burton films, which I've been a lifelong fan of Tim Burton.
Oh
And
yeah,
I
sure.
love that mix of, scary and spooky and the dark elements, but there's always something that's like kind of endearing about it. And so that's what I really tried to capture with Heckna. So it's a carnival where there's a lot of evil people, a lot of people out to get you, but it's also really fun and just silly. There's so many puns, like so many adventure aspects were just based off of puns. I think that groups that will enjoy that kind of humor are just going to love Heckna, because there's just so much of that. And Heckna, as just the titular character, which was inspired by Vecna, I guess it became it was an inside joke at Hit Point Press. So that's how the name Heckna came about. It was inspired by Vecna from D&D. But he is a really fun villain, and he's very much like Beetlejuice-esque,
Right.
but I'd say a little bit more evil than Beetlejuice, because even though Beetlejuice he can be kind of a jerk, I never feel like he's flat out evil, but Heckna is definitely leans a little bit more toward evil, but still has the same kind of sardonic attitude, is always joking no matter what the situation is, and it just makes for a really fun villain for DMs to play at their table.
Oh yeah, that sounds like a blast to role play that that character as an NPC. Yeah, it's interesting how Vecna is so inspiring. I mean,
yeah, right. I feel like of the many classic D&D characters, especially villains, Vecna is definitely up there, one of the top.
And even they didn't have to say anything about him other than that his hand.
Uh-oh. I think we lost Peter. Well.
And his eye were artifacts. That's all they had to say.
I hear you.
Oh, am I back?
Yes.
Yeah. What?
I was just gonna start improving, but I'm glad you're back.
This is a nail biter of an episode we got here. Hey. So this it looked like from the description that this sort of carnival will travel planes and like coming, like phase in out in the woods somewhere near some unsuspecting village. Is that kind of the idea? And then like you got to go check it out.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a fun campaign that you could even slot into other existing campaigns.
Sure.
We kind of very loosely, in terms of just like the structure, not so much story themes, but we kind of used Curse of Strahd as our inspiration.
I was thinking Ravenloft.
Absolutely, very Ravenloft-esque. And I love Ravenloft, very much obsessed with Ravenloft. So I think you can kind of think of it as like a domain in Ravenloft. Right. Of course, it has its own, all of its own things. But I think if you are playing a Ravenloft campaign, especially long-term, visit the Revelia. I think it fits perfectly into that.
Wow, now I have an idea for a Christmas gift from my sister.
Ooh.
I mean, she's a huge Ravenloft fan. But this just got funded. It's not available yet, is it? It's going to be.
It is not. It'll be available next year. There is some free playtest content, some really fun stuff to play with already. So that might be something to send your sister if she's into that.
Christmas 2021. That'll be fine. Yeah,
nobody
wants to get a gift in 2020. It's gonna be, it's probably good. It's like I don't want a memorabilia from 2020.
Yep, that is so true.
Okay, we got just a little bit of time to talk about maybe one other project before we get to our final question and wrap up. I'm scared to switch windows and look at the list of products you did, because it's usually when I switch windows on my system that I lock up. So pick a project that you've worked on that you'd like to tell me a little bit about for a couple minutes.
Let's see. I feel like a good one that we didn't quite talk about, but it's recently released, so I feel like it's relevant, was Icewind Dale, Rime of the
Oh,
Frostmaiden.
of course, of course, of course. Yes, yes. I should have remembered that from memory. So what was your role in this project, first of all?
Sure. So I am a co-author of Rime of the Frostmaiden. I've done other projects with Wizards of the Coast before, but this was the biggest, and I was very excited to contribute to an official hardcover book. So I would say that that's probably my highlight for 2020 of this whole wretched year. But that was a great thing that came out of it, was that Rime of the Frostmaiden was released.
Now this is set in Icewind Dale, right?
Correct.
And which is Forgotten Realms, or country or something like that, or a region, I guess, if I remember right. And so what is sort of the synopsis of the adventure? Like what's the idea behind the adventure in this book?
Sure. So Rime of the Frostmaiden is about, the region of Icewind Dale, specifically this area called the 10 Towns, which are 10 towns that are caught in this everlasting winter inflicted upon them by Oral, or I always say Oral wrong. I guess it's supposed to be Oriel. That doesn't sound right to me, but apparently that's how Chris Perkins says it. So Oral, the Frostmaiden, who is a goddess, the goddess of winter, and she wants to keep winter everlasting. And so the characters who play in this campaign, their goal is to try to break the spell so that life in the 10 towns can return to normal, because as it stands now, it is very difficult to live there with just this constant snow and ice, and it's cold beyond cold, so it's not a very pleasant place to live. But there's lots of fun things to do there. But that's kind of the main theme of Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden, is trying to break the Frostmaiden spell, which sometimes means going up against the Frostmaiden herself, which is fun. I think she's a wonderful villain, and that's the gist of that book.
That's great. Fabulous. Good. So I have a sort of a final question for you as we're running out of time. So what do you, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is amazing game. I think Magic and D&D are the two best games ever published, and it has a long history, going clear back to the 70s. What do you hope to contribute to this franchise?
Such a thoughtful question. I will say that what I have gotten from D&D that I find most special is the community and the friendship. And so my goal is always, as a creator, is always to pay it forward in some capacity. So if I feel like I've gotten an opportunity or some, metric of success, that I enable that for someone else, which is really what we try to do for the workshop. So I would say that even beyond the writing that I do, I hope that the educational resources that I provide are something that become more, I guess, more common, and just fostering a community where getting started is always encouraged, and everyone has a story to tell, and that there's a community there for you when you're ready to tell your story, is just kind of my personal value, and something that I hope a lot of my work represents. So I would say in that sense, just making sure that our community remains inclusive and kind and supportive, and communal storytelling is the best vessel for that. And I'm just glad to be part of the legacy of D&D, and hopefully bringing new people to it to continue the legacy moving forward.
Well, I think that sounds fabulous. This is, inclusivity has been such an important new theme. I mean, it's been around, but I mean, it's had so much more emphasis in recent times, and that's really great. I always felt like Dungeons and Dragons was inherently inclusive. It was a game for the geeks back in the day, people that didn't fit into other parts of society, and it continues to be that way. So that's great. Well, I think that thank you very much for being on our show today, Ashley. I really appreciate it, and I wish you the best for wherever this takes you.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here and to chat with you about Warlocks, especially.
Yes, indeed. We'll have to come back to having a conversation about all the different character classes.
Yes, please.
All right. Well, that wraps up another episode of Fireside with Peter Adkison on Gen Con TV. We will not have an episode next week. It's election week. We will be hiding out in the Gen Con bunker. And assuming that it's safe to come out, we will be back on November 11th, and our guest will be Sadie Lowry. In the meantime, we have lots of other great programming here on Gen Con TV. We have this Friday, we have Gen Con's Halloween weekend. Woohoo! Sponsored by Free League starting at 2 p.m. Join Bonsai, Emma, Derek, and Isabel Von Ghoul for a special spooky episode of Table Takes. And then at 4 p.m. on Friday, Pacific time, the Free League and Gen Con TV have come together for a special presentation of Alien, the role-playing game, GM'd by Derek Gooder, and I can attest Derek is a great GM of this game, with other members of the Gen Con family. At 8 p.m., we wrap up the evening with a Gen Con watch party of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Woo, nice. And then on Saturday, we'll be having a Discord community gaming day on Gen Con Discord, so come see Discord for more information. On Monday next week at 6 p.m. Pacific, we'll have the board games with their brothers Murph. And then on Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Pacific, board games with This Game Gets Dicey. And so if you miss any of our shows, you will find most of our streams up within about a day or two on the on YouTube on the Gen Con video channel, and including the episodes we filmed historically with people working on Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons. Also, if you want to connect with other Gen Con fans, please join our Discord community on the official Gen Con Discord server. Please remember to follow, subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell your friends about our show. Thanks once again to our guests, Ashley Warren, our studio manager, Marcus Mays, our producer, Derek Gooder, to Dungeon Masters Guilds for introducing us to the new voices in Dungeons and Dragons, to Gen Con TV for hosting, and most of all, thank you for watching.